Morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Oltmans. I'm the Chief of Grant Strategy at Robin Hood, and I'm so pleased to be joined this morning by part of the team of researchers from Columbia University who partner with Robin Hood on the Poverty Tracker, including Garfinkel, Sophie Collyer, Chris Wimer, and Elizabeth Doran. The Poverty Tracker was launched in 2012 as a partnership between Robin Hood and Columbia, with the goal of going beyond simple measures of poverty, which primarily focus on whether or not somebody is living above or below the poverty line. Our goal was to gain a better understanding of the experiences of people living in poverty. We also want to better understand the dynamic nature of poverty. As you heard from Wes in his opening, and you'll hear from the team in a minute, if we look at things over time, we see that many more people are experiencing poverty than we traditionally expect. Many families also face very high levels of economic insecurity, lacking even a very small amount of emergency savings, making them vulnerable to economic shocks or common life events. This is especially true for households with young children who face higher levels of poverty and hardship. We also see that tens of thousands of New Yorkers are facing unstable housing or evictions every year. It's probably not surprising to many of you in this room who are experiencing and hearing these challenges from families every single day. So for this session, we're going to go through findings from 4 of our recent reports from the Poverty Tracker. And to kick things off, Garfinkel will talk us through our second annual report on poverty and disadvantage. This year, we really focused on harnessing the longitudinal power of the Poverty Tracker to look at what's happening over time and to look at the situations that increase the likelihood that somebody falls into poverty. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Irv.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. So it's a great privilege to be able to study poverty and disadvantage in New York City, and I thank the Robin Hood Foundation for that wonderful collaboration and opportunity. New York City is the richest, most diverse, most populous city in the country. It's also a port of entry for immigrants, and it's the center of world capitalism. And capitalism produces great riches, and unfortunately, alongside that, produces by its nature a lot of economic insecurity. And this morning, what you'll see from the Poverty Tracker annual report, which I'm going to summarize, is lots of evidence of economic insecurity. So let me say something first about our approach. We interview a random sample of New Yorkers every 4 times a year. In the beginning, we only followed them for 2 years. Now we're following all of the sample for 4 years. And we measure poverty on an annual basis, hardship, and health. And we also collect a lot of data on other aspects of well-being, including assets and debts, self-rating of well-being, health, and mental health, and lots of other variables. So I should say I've only got 6 minutes, so I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. So here we see the slide that describes poverty in New York City and compares that to national poverty rates. Let me say something about the definition of poverty that we're using. For a family of 4, it comes to about $36,000 a year. If you're below that, you're poor. If you're above that, you're not poor. We use the supplementary measure of poverty published by the Census Bureau. It differs from the official measure of poverty, also published by the Census Bureau. In many respects, most respects, it's superior. I'm just going to mention 2 which are fundamental for our understanding today. of how this differs from the official measure. So first, the official measure doesn't count benefits that are near cash, like housing subsidies, like the food stamp program, like the earned income tax credit and other tax credits. Those are cash, but they're not received monthly, on a monthly basis. They're only received annually, so official measure doesn't count any of that. The supplementary poverty measure counts that, and my last slide, I'll come back to that. The second difference, which is very important as well, is that the official measure takes no account of differences in the cost of living. And as New Yorkers, we all know that New York City is much more expensive than most other places in the United States. You'll note in this slide that poverty over time in New York City has decreased. It's higher than the national poverty rate, but the slope is the same. Poverty has been decreasing, and the official measure would show the same thing, and it's because of the economic recovery. So in 2012, we were just coming out of the Great Recession. Unemployment has been going down throughout this entire period and continues to be very low now as well. That's what explains that trend. So want to note that women and people of color are much more likely to be living in poverty. Note in particular that the highest poverty rates are Hispanics, and the next highest are Asian Americans. So not only poverty, but hardship has also been declining over time. And hardship, you think of hardship as not having your utilities shut off, not having enough money, you having to go hungry, to go without shelter, or to not see a doctor because you couldn't afford it. And actually that last one, not going to take care of your health because you couldn't afford it, is the most common hardship in New York City. So the trend you can see is the same, down over time, which is what we would expect. But notice it's 30% in the last year as compared to only 20% that were in poverty. Unlike poverty and the hardship, health has not declined as the economy has improved, and that's pretty common actually, nor has mental health changed. The most interesting aspect that Sarah referred to is following these families over time, and here we show a picture of what's happened to poverty over a 4-year period. Even though only 1 in 5 were poor in the last year we looked at, half of all New Yorkers experience poverty in one of the 4 years. Most are only poor for 1 year, but 4% are poor all 4 years. This slide shows the same thing is true for hardship. Slightly over half experience hardship, and most of those experience it for just a short time. But actually, the hardship is more equally distributed in terms of how many experience it all 4 years or 3 years, more widespread. This slide should really be labeled hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers fall into poverty and hardship each year. I did my math wrong. 14% of the number of families who were above poverty, which is about 80% in 1 year. It's hundreds of thousands. So common life events like ending a relationship, losing a job, or having a child increase the likelihood of falling into poverty and hardship. And notice, having a child is the most common. In this slide, notice that both assets and education are protective factors. Just take a look at the last, on the far right, you'll see that those with a college degree who have a child, only 10% of them fall into poverty, whereas having a child, for those with high school or less education, almost half of those families get pushed into poverty. The last slide I want to talk about, I think, is the most important. And just look in the far right, and you'll see that if it were not for these transfer programs, 31% of New Yorkers would experience poverty. But because of these programs, only 20% experience poverty. That's no mean achievement, but we need to and can do more, and that is our challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Irv. I think it's just worth emphasizing the fact that common life events, something just like having a child or ending a relationship or losing a job, might be the thing that pushes you into poverty. I think that we can expect that will happen. These things will happen to most people over time, and so I think it speaks to some of the challenges we face in addressing these issues. I just also want to mention, Irv, that both this report and last year's annual report were big contributors in helping to shape Robin Hood's strategic direction to lift households sustainably out of poverty. So next up, Sophie Collyer is going to present the findings from our report on forced moves. As you'll hear, this report allowed us to look at the reasons renters move, including evictions, and where families are likely to end up. This information is really helping to influence our policy work and to provide a strong case for doing more to prevent evictions. Sophie?
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today, and I'm just going to dive right in. Now, research tells us that housing stability is fundamental to economic mobility, and forced relocation by way of an eviction or another type of forced moves directly threatens this stability. This report takes a first look at the experiences and economic trajectories of New Yorkers who are forced out of their homes. And you'll see that the results really underscore the importance of Robin Hood's support for the right to counsel legislation that works to keep New Yorkers in their homes by providing low-income families with access to free legal service in the event of an eviction. And there are also efforts to build on this legislation currently before the City Council, so I'll discuss that in a little bit. Now, measuring the prevalence of forced moves can be a challenge, particularly their context and their outcomes. Administrative data can shed light on the number of evictions in a place like New York City, but these data sources don't tell us much about how families were doing before they were evicted or where they ended up afterwards. And we all know that, especially from anecdotal evidence, that formal evictions are not the only type of forced relocation that happens in the city. But those moves don't show up in administrative records. An amazing thing about the poverty tracker is its ability to measure multiple types of forced moves and capture the economic circumstances and experiences of families before and after these moves, which is what we focus on in this report. Now, the report really builds on the work of Matthew Desmond, who studies the intersection of, or has studied the intersection of poverty, housing, and forced moves. And we use his framework to group moves into 3 different types that you'll see up here. So there are forced moves, responsive moves, and voluntary moves. Now, forced moves are moving, or all the categories of forced moves include formal evictions, as we've talked about, but there are also informal evictions. So just moving because your landlord tells you to, or missing a rent payment and moving out of fear of being evicted. There are other types of forced moves too, including moving because your building was sold or condemned, or because you were being harassed by your landlord. Now, our data shows that about 300,000 families in rental housing move in a year. And of those moves, 19%, or 56,000, are the result of a forced move. This translates to 100,000 New Yorkers being forced out of their homes in the years that we studied. And of those forced moves, About 46% are the result of a formal eviction. It's the most common type of forced move in the city, and it really speaks to the importance of those legal protections that I discussed earlier that are provided through the right to counsel legislation. But the remaining 54% of forced moves aren't these formal evictions. They're these silent evictions or informal evictions, and they're never going to be litigated in a housing court. Now, there's legislation in front of the City Council right now that increases funding for tenant advocate groups who work closely with tenants and would really work to, we'd hope in the long run, counter this trend of silent evictions, because those tenant advocates let tenants know about the right to be free from harassment, the fact that building violations need to be addressed, and that there are legal protections in the event of an eviction if that takes place. Like I said, we're able to look at the experiences of New Yorkers before facing a forced move. And we find that over half of New Yorkers who face one of these moves face a material hardship like those that Irv discussed. They also are very rent burdened. Over half are paying more than 40% of their household income on rent and face elevated rates of mental distress. Now, what happens after moving? Here we look at the predicted probability of living in a high poverty neighborhood before and after a move. On the left is just the people who don't move, and on the right is those who are evicted either formally or informally. Now, before moving, we see that they're less likely than the average renter to live in a high poverty neighborhood, where over 30% of residents live below the poverty line. But after moving, this doubles to 26%, more than doubles, excuse me, which just shows you how forced relocation and forced moves are playing a role in concentrating poverty in New York City and moving families away from economic opportunity. Altogether, these findings speak to the consequences of forced relocation in New York City and the importance of policies that make sure all New Yorkers have access to stable homes. So thanks so much, and I'm going to pass it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Sophie. I think those findings about forced moves were particularly important in light of David Williams' talk earlier and neighborhood and its role as children grow up in high opportunity neighborhoods. So now I'm going to hand it over to Chris Wimer, who's going to share findings from our report on emergency savings and assets.
Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, as both Sarah and Irv have said, these sort of commonplace events or shocks that New Yorkers experience are potentially likely to send them cascading into a spell of poverty or an spell of material hardship. So one of the neat things about the poverty tracker is because we run it in-house at Columbia and we're constantly in the field, we're surveying people every 3 months, it's a nimble tool to be able to add questions to deepen our understanding of New Yorkers' experiences when a policy or programmatic question comes up. So one of those questions that came up was how prepared are New Yorkers to weather a financial shock? And that's what I'm going to talk about today, briefly. So the Federal Reserve Board periodically asks in a national study on economic well-being, how prepared Americans are to deal with the hypothetical expense of $400. But as with a lot of these large national data sets, the sample size isn't big enough to really get a portrait in New York City. So the poverty tracker can help fill that gap. So we added a couple of questions to understand how households would pay or could pay or would pay for an unexpected expense and whether New Yorkers also have the assets to weather such an emergency. So this is a common question. You probably heard about it in the news. You know, like say you experienced an unexpected expense of $400. Would you be able to pay for that, and how would you be able to pay for that? So on this slide, we show the results from the Federal Reserve, but then also the results from the poverty tracker. And you can see it's pretty similar percentages of New Yorkers who couldn't pay for a $400 expense with cash or cash as functional equivalent. And functional equivalent just means, you know, paying with a credit card that you pay off at the end of the month. So slightly higher for New York, 45%. So almost half of New Yorkers say they couldn't pay for a $400 expense. We also looked at like what New Yorkers would do in the face of a $400 expense. And we compared that also to the reasons that Americans gave in the national sample. And actually, the methods that New Yorkers would use look quite similar to the national sample. So most people would put it on a credit card and pay it off over time. And the key differences in New York City versus America as a whole is New Yorkers were less likely to say that they would be able to sell something to pay for an expense. So you think of New Yorkers in smaller apartments with less less goods and things that they could turn around for quick cash. They're more likely to use a quote unquote other method. And when we coded up those verbatim responses, we find that often what people would say they would do would be to draw down some of their assets, so some of their financial assets to pay for such an expense. But note that 30% of New Yorkers say that they just wouldn't be able to pay for such an expense at all, period. And that's also similar to the national level for the same thing. There are also these stark racial and ethnic disparities in the data. So this shows the percent who could not pay for the $400 expense at all by race and ethnicity. And the arrows above the blue bar on the left and the two middle bars on the right, we split people into low, medium, and high income groups, just based on thirds of the income distribution. And note that Black and Hispanic New Yorkers in the high income group are just as likely to say that they couldn't pay for an unanticipated expense as whites in the lowest income group. So that's a really stark racial and ethnic disparity that we see in the data. And you think about things like the social networks people have access to, the types of assets that people have access to might help explain some of these disparities between groups. We also, because we have a comprehensive data set on economic well-being that we're looking at in the poverty tracker, we're able to also measure people's assets and debts, as Irv alluded to. And we create a measure of asset poverty, which means you don't have enough net worth or assets to be able to cover 3 months of routine expenses as defined by the poverty line. So if we just compare people who are asset poor, those who don't have enough assets to cover 3 months of expenses versus those who are not asset poor, we do see that assets are sort of protective against these emergency expenses, but not completely. So even having some of these assets doesn't fully protect you from or ensure you to be able to cover such an emergency expense. So just to sum up, for most households, people will use credit cards in order as a first line of defense when dealing with an unanticipated expense like this. Assets do seem to be protective, so things that promote asset ownership and asset development among New Yorkers can help insure against some of these shocks. And while some New Yorkers have social support from their family and friends, many report that a $400 emergency is one that they simply couldn't pay to begin with. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So we at Robin Hood have been using this information to help drive some solutions, including working with some of our partners to fund low cost or no cost, no interest loans in case somebody has an emergency expense. They can at least turn to that cash so that they don't have the same sort of cascading long-term impacts from not having short-term cash access. So from here, we're going to turn to Elizabeth Doran, who's going to talk about results from our Early Childhood Poverty Tracker, which is a newer partnership with Columbia.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. And as Sarah said, I'm going to be talking about the Early Childhood Poverty Tracker. This was created to better understand the dynamics of disadvantage, specifically among the youngest New Yorkers. So the Early Childhood Poverty Tracker is structured similar to the main poverty tracker that Irv described, but we focus specifically on children under the age of 3. Building off of the poverty tracker, we have these repeated measures every 3 months, asking families specifically about income poverty, material hardship, and health. And I think one of the really wonderful things about this data set is that we've been working with New York City to be able to build a long-term partnership as these children age. So we will have administrative data from the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Mental Health that we can link to the children in our survey and follow their long-term outcomes. So stay tuned for that in a few years. So I'm going to talk kind of the important findings from our baseline report, which was released in November of 2019. So we find that almost a quarter of young children in New York are living in poverty, and that represents approximately 100,000 young children. Poverty is particularly and disproportionately prevalent among Black and Hispanic children. We also know that poverty is not the only way to measure disadvantage, and families can struggle and still be technically above the poverty line. So we also look at material hardship. And as Irv mentioned, when we think about material hardship, it's the ability to meet material needs. So families who are experiencing material hardship might not be able to pay a utility bill. They might not be able to afford medical care or to afford to be able to put food on the table. And we find that 38% of young New Yorkers are living in a family experiencing material hardship. As with poverty, we find that Black and Hispanic children are disproportionately likely to experience material hardship, and children living in single-parent families. We also looked at the mental health of the parents in our survey, and we asked a series of questions, really getting at depression and anxiety to create this combination measure of psychological distress. We know that when parents are experiencing suboptimal mental health, it can be hard not only to meet their needs, but also to meet the needs of their children. And among our survey, we find that a third of all young children in New York are living in households with parents experiencing either moderate or severe psychological distress. When we look at households in poverty and single-parent households, these rates are even higher. And this ties in really nicely to what David Williams spoke about earlier today, looking at low opportunity neighborhoods. So Raj Chetty and David Williams and their colleagues have done really wonderful, groundbreaking research looking at the way that neighborhood context informs life trajectories. And they found that some neighborhoods expand opportunities for children and others contract opportunity. So we measure low opportunity neighborhoods in New York as ones in which at least 20% of all households are living in poverty. And using this measure, we find that almost half of all young children in New York are living in these low opportunity neighborhoods. So one of the things that I think I've said on almost every slide is that different groups of children have different risks for these disadvantages. And we particularly find that Black and Hispanic children are disproportionately at risk for experiencing poverty, material hardship, and health problems. So these findings are alarming in the fact that we know that the context in which children grow up dictates long-term outcomes and short-term outcomes in terms of health, development, and overall well-being. So we're looking forward to continuing our partnerships with New York Cities and better understanding how we can support these children in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. The Early Childhood Poverty Tracker is really just a great example of our growing partnership with Columbia. It was a project that was really built off of a partnership with the city's health department. We piggybacked off of their child health survey. And it's unique in the fact that we're able to look at not just early childhood, but the specific New York City context. So we can think about some of the policy changes that are happening here, programs like Pre-K for All and other things that will help inform our work going forward. We also know that early childhood is such an important part of achieving long-term economic mobility. So we perceive this project as being something that's really going to help inform our work going forward. So I just want to say thank you to the Columbia team. They've been wonderful partners, really building a one-of-a-kind data set that's helping to inform Robin Hood's day-to-day work, really driving the work on the ground. But I also want to say to the people in this room, we hope that this becomes not just a tool for us, but a tool for you as well. So we'd love to hear from you, love to get an email from you if there are things you'd like to see, questions that you'd like us to be asking in these surveys over time with households. We'd love to hear from you and make this more of a resource to you as well. So thank you for your time. We look forward to hearing from you.